Rob, great to connect. Glad to be joining you today.
Hey, huge honor to be here. I'm a big fan, so thank you.
Yeah, I think we were going to make this happen years ago when you had written Wired to Eat, but for some reason, I can't remember exactly what had happened, but it didn't work. Timing was off. I don't know, something. But here we
Right.
are now, and so it's all good.
Awesome. Well, again, huge honor to be here. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, anytime I hear somebody making the case for eating more beef, I got to say I'm a fan. So that's what I'm looking forward to, talking to you about
Awesome.
meat consumption and why we ought to encourage it more, just culturally and society, and how it's good for the planet and all the stuff I'm sure we'll get into.
Well, it'll be nice to be on a non-adversarial podcast for once, so
Do you get
that'll
a
be
lot? Do you
great.
get invited to be on podcasts that are more, vegan type podcasts that want to be controversial? Or
It's more like media. So the media will
yes,
kind of bring you in, and usually, ironically, it's somebody that's pretty uh, open to the idea of regenerative agriculture and a meat inclusive food system and all that stuff, but for whatever reason, like there's this sense in journalism that balanced journalism is just take two polar opposite extremes and explore them a little bit, and then somehow that
yeah.
brings you to some middle ground, and it's really funny. Yeah, yeah.
What's interesting is I had a friend in my financial planning practice because we talked a lot about averages. That's my background in the financial planning sector, retail management a little too, but financial planning. And we talked about averages in the stock market. He said, well, technically, if you put your feet in the oven and your head in an ice bath, it might average out to the right temperature, but you're still going to be miserable, right?
Yeah,
So I think that ties into what you're saying.
that is a beautiful analogy. Yeah, yeah. And that was so much of the challenge of writing this book, Sacred Cow, which and again, I don't want to enter into this thing. Like people are so in this mode of like, this is the truth. All that stuff is BS, and everything's hyper polarized. So I try to almost sneak up on this stuff, but I'll make the case that the kind of vegan centric anti meat world, they're playing this kind of asymmetric warfare where they'll take these little hand grenades where they say, meat causes cancer, and they throw it over the fence and then they run away.
Right.
Meat destroys the environment, and they run, and it seems super credible. You can pull up some seemingly peer-reviewed studies that seem to support their position, and for the average person who's just trying to live their life, it seems pretty compelling. And then for
Mm-hmm.
someone like myself or my co-author Diana Rogers to get in and really do diligence on that, like you can just dismiss it. You're like, oh, those people are idiots, and then I guess we just continue to draw these like entrenched lines. But if you're really going to unpack that stuff, like, does meat really increase your likelihood of cancer? Well, there's a whole mini PhD dissertation involved with doing a legitimate job of unpacking that. And that still assumes that we did the job properly. Like maybe we did it wrong, but even in the process of trying to do it well, there's an enormous amount of effort and information and nuance and detail, and then you're fighting up against the attention span that folks have. And it's interesting
Definitely.
because we have two seemingly push pull things going on, at least in my view, where people are like they're calling it now the attention economy. Like that's actually what, it's not
Right.
eyeballs or likes, it's actually how long can you keep people engaged. So that's happening on the one hand, and then on the other hand we have these long format type of processes like what you're doing, Joe Rogan and some other people,
Mm-hmm.
where we were able to go really deep and get into a lot of nuance and whatnot. And I honestly think that it's those things like what you're doing, what Rogan's doing, that provides enough hope for me to not just like drive my car off a cliff and call it a day, because it's really a challenge to try to motor through all this material and get anywhere. But so far, the book has been really well received. Folks have been getting a lot of value out of it. So it definitely has been interesting, trying to unpack all of these different topics and do diligence with it, and also do it in a way that's not just painting my kind of social political worldview into it, like really trying to undermine my assumptions first, and then try to find what are the things that when we really pressure test the assumptions, what are the things that are left.
I appreciate men like yourself because you are willing to go deep. And I think the majority of us, I would actually place myself in the same category that we look at things on the surface level. We look for things potentially that are, a little bit more sexy maybe and not researched and as detailed and in depth as you've gone. And then also, I tend to be very, maybe intuitive is the right word, but very anecdotal. I look at meat, for example, and I think, well, I like the taste of meat. And from my perspective, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, humans have been eating meat for tens of thousands of years. So there's probably something to it. And that's like the extent of what I know and why I eat meat myself. So
Right.
I'm anxious to delve into this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we could say, okay, a really good like tomahawk steak tastes amazing, and you eat it, and generally you feel pretty good after eating it, and like
Yes.
there's good physical performance and
If
all
it's
that
not too
stuff.
much, like for
Yeah,
me, if I eat too much, I start to get like, I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have had that. But if I do it moderately, I feel good. I feel
yeah.
strong. I feel energized. I feel good if I do it in moderation.
And that's maybe one of these nice compare and contrast things because a really good cheesecake also tastes amazing, but there's not many people that will do even a modest serving of cheesecake and afterwards are like, man, I'm all full of piss and vinegar and let's go do some jujitsu or something. Usually
Right,
like, oh my
right.
God, what did I do to myself? And I think that that's a pretty good litmus test for kind of cutting through the dietary wars. Some people do better on higher carb, some people do better on lower carb, but by and large, people don't look, feel, or perform particularly well when they're doing a significant amount of refined food. And that is another one of these kind of commonalities where everything circles around that central position. And it's not to say you never have a plate of nachos or something like that, but there's just some of that feedback where do I look, feel, and perform well eating this consistently or even intermittently? And then those things that you do well with, if you do more of that, then it just all kinds of good things seem to come out of that.
Well, I think the other thing, and I know I run into this, is I assume most human beings are looking for the short term immediate gratification. So if you have that plate of nachos, you're going to get the energy, you feel really good, it tastes really good, but you don't really think about the long term ramifications or impacts of that. Because I know if I have the whole bag of chips and salsa, which I'm prone to do, I feel really good immediately. And then 2 hours later, I'm like, oh, like
What did
just
I
just the
do?
way I
Yeah.
feel digestively. I'm like,
Yeah.
nah, I probably shouldn't have done that. And then tomorrow I'll go ahead and do it again because I forgot
Right.
all about that stuff and I just want to it to taste good.
Yeah, yeah, and that does harken back to our evolutionary biology a little bit. Like if you, and it's funny, the real evidence-based nutrition folks really push back on some of this like paleo diet, ancestral health stuff, which I'm really perplexed by because there was a Russian scientist, Theodosis Dovzyansky, that had a quote that nothing in biology makes sense but through the light of evolution. And so if that's true, and if this kind of evolutionary biology is really something that informs the way to understand biology, it's kind of like understanding quantum mechanics when we talk about physics. Like if it's one of these kind of foundational pieces, then in some way that stuff needs to inform what we do. And when we start looking at our evolutionary biology, we're not rewarded in a natural environment from like running around like crazy, burning as much energy as possible, and then eating a salad. Like we're
Right.
rewarded by eating as much nutrient dense, calorie dense food as we can, and then saving energy. And there's a great reality show right now alone where people are sent out and they're basically out there trying to figure out how to live. And what they've figured out almost immediately is like fat and energy dense food is what wins the day. And a guy ended up killing like a caribou or something, and he really had an amazing skill set. Like he rendered a bunch of the fat and had it in like skin bags and put it up in a tree, and then some wolverines climbed the tree and ate all of his fat. And he ended up, everybody thought that this guy was going to win this show,
Right,
like
because you
he
had
was
this
just
caribou,
crushing it.
sure.
But these other animals that live by these same principles, like they need as much energy as possible, doing as little as possible in order to survive. And if that's true, if that's the environment that we've been forged in, then it's really hard to vilify people if they live in an environment where, particularly in COVID, like we ended up getting into a pattern where we ordered the bulk of our food to our front door because you now can do that. Like we had
Sure.
meat delivered and, a bunch of other stuff delivered. And we generally made pretty good choices, but man, it would be really easy to just like, oh, chips and salsa today, ice cream and cheesecake tomorrow. And then on the third day, why don't we make a combo of both of them? We've got a little bit of leftovers there. And there is, if this idea that we are wired to eat more and move less, if that's our default state, and then we're in an environment where we can do almost no movement and eat everything, then we're really set up for a dangerous situation. Like it's going to be very difficult to win that. And there's, it's kind of interesting because there is a personal accountability piece to this story that people need to embrace and recognize. But at the same time, I don't think people realize that the desire to eat the whole bag of chips and then have the ice cream and then have a couple of cocktails, like that's totally reasonable. Like from a survival perspective, that is great internal wiring, but it just happens to be really a bad idea in the current, environment that we live in.
It's interesting because you're talking about this eating more and move less, and the way you're framing that makes sense to me. And I think that probably worked when resources were scarce. But
Right.
we live in a society now that resources are abundant. If I want ice cream, I got ice cream. If I want chips and salsa, I got chips and salsa. If I want a drink, I can go down to the convenience store and get a drink immediately. I can get whatever I want at any time of day immediately. And I think the abundance has set us up for failure in a lot of ways, specifically with our food choices.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that that's where if we just recognize that at the outset, we still need to take personal accountability. We still need to make better decisions. But it's interesting when I wrote the second book, Wired to Eat. One of the largest groups of people that I got positive feedback from were people who had had disordered eating in the past. And they always felt like they were horrible people, like they were broken. And I really made the case that I'm like, you're not broken. This is normal. It doesn't
You're a
mean
human
you can
being.
keep doing it. Yeah, you're a human being. This is completely to be expected. And now that you understand that, we need to make some choices that are going to give you a different outcome. Now that you're enlightened to that, we can't just keep doing the same old, same old. So that's been cool because like that's a cross section of people that are really hard to reach, and they suffer a lot. And there's and not only do they suffer, particularly like a father who isn't as healthy and robust as he can be for his family. Think about all the failure points there. Like if he's raising a couple of young boys, is he going to wrestle and hike and go out shooting and do all this stuff? Like, and so there's a whole second life that people basically get if they get their health on track, and they're able to be so much more effective and enjoy their life more.
You're so right. For me, for example, it's been probably at this point close to 6 years, but I got up to 235 pounds. So as a man who's 5'10", that's 50 pounds at least overweight.
Right.
And I remember vividly, and the guys who've listened to this podcast know this because they've heard this story. I came home and my boys were jumping on my leg. I've got 4 kids, but my 2 oldest boys were jumping on my legs. Dad, let's go jump on the trampoline. And I remember like it was yesterday. I had to look them in the eye and tell them, I'm sorry, guys, I can't. Because I literally could not. I was exhausted from the day, from my work, which was sitting behind a desk and a computer. Right. I shouldn't have been exhausted. I was beat down. And that was the light switch for me, that I can't even jump on the trampoline with my boys. How bad has this gotten? And, life has changed and pivoted because of that and some other things that have happened in my life. But yeah, when you talk about this second life that opens up for you, this enhanced version of yourself and your family dynamics, man, it's amazing what opens up when you can show some restraint and get these food choices in line.
Yeah, and I would even go, it honestly can't really be restraint. You've actually got to plan. And so one of the first things that I have folks do when they start embarking on some dietary change is you've got to go in and just gut your pantry. Like everything's got to go. And I mean
Right.
like everything. And even the kids are going to be eating different. It's like, well, I'm
Right.
going to leave
No
the
fruit
goldfish.
snacks,
And
no goldfish. Yes, the
I was just
goldfish.
going to
You
say the
said it.
goldfish. It's like little Jimmy doesn't need the fucking goldfish. Like nobody
Right.
needs the goldfish, you know? And if you go out to eat and you want to kick your heels up, then that's great. But the thing is this would be like going to the Playboy Mansion, getting pissed drunk, and having a bunch of women throw themselves at us and like, oh yeah, I'm totally going to maintain my
Yeah, I'm good.
loyalty to my wife. No,
Right.
that's ridiculous. And so I would even go like people. It's almost a self-defense strategy. Like if you don't want to get in fights, don't go to biker bars. And on this food thing, you just need to plan ahead. Like nobody lays in bed at night thinking about like, oh man, that pork loin and broccoli in the fridge is just really calling to me. But the little Debbie snack cakes and the ice cream, like
For sure.
that's what you want to get up out of bed and get in the. And again, it's not to say that you never have that stuff, or like at holidays and birthdays, you don't kick your heels up and have a little more fun. But once that stuff's done, it's done. It gets bagged up. It either gets pitched. We have a bunch of chickens and stuff. And so that all goes in, and our chickens are probably going to be diabetic at some point, but better them than me.
Well, they're going to sacrifice themselves at some point, so you might as well make them happy while they're still alive.
Yeah. Give them a little bonus there. But yeah, I would just, it's kind of a subtle distinction, but it can't be restraint. Like self-control is such a perishable thing. And I think so many of the folks that follow you, they're entrepreneurial, they're hard chargers, they're go-getters. So many of the people that follow you, they already have hit decision fatigue by like 8:30 or 9 a.m. in the morning. They've made
Definitely.
1,000 decisions. And their day is barely even getting going. And one of the first things to go in that decision fatigue process is the ability to make good choices around food. And we will default to the easiest, the tastiest. And that is where, you've got to have some planning. It's really funny. I have two girls, but one of the girls was lamenting the other day. She's like, and it's so funny because I think that this is something from like a sitcom where somebody said this, but she said, Dad, we don't have any food. We just have things to make food out of. Like she was really frustrated that there wasn't like a buffet there or something. Like, yeah, I get it. Here we go. We get to cook again, So
Yeah.
it's funny.
One of the things a friend of mine told me, Josiah Novak, and he's coached me a little bit with my food choices and also my strength training, is he talks about the best thing you can do and the easiest, most simple way to shop is look for single ingredient items. So that's your vegetables. Of course, beef would fall into line. It's your single ingredient items, and you're just consuming that. But it is really interesting you're talking about discipline, because one thing we've addressed before is, you have motivation and inspiration, which serves its purpose. But it's a lower tier of getting the thing done, right? So you have motivation, inspiration. Then next you have your discipline. That's better, right? I'm going to make decisions not regarding how I feel, but just because I committed to doing it.
Right.
And then this third component is the strategy or systems. And this is what you're talking about. So a system is eliminating the temptation. Now the temptation's not even there. That's the highest tier of ensuring that you do what you've committed to actually doing.
Yeah. There was a really interesting study where they looked at how people consumed peanut M&Ms, which I'm hard pressed to think of something more amazing than peanut M&Ms. Like I'm not a super sweet guy, but you get some
Peanut
salty
butter
crunchy
M&Ms
with it.
Now you might get me there, but not peanut M&Ms.
Okay, well it's in the neighborhood,
Sure, close enough.
They did a fascinating study where they set folks up where they had 3 different options for eating these peanut M&Ms, and it was cool because the M&Ms are quantifiable. It's like they put 150 of them on the table, and so you count them. So it was really cool in that regard. But what they did is they had a group of people where they had a bowl of peanut M&Ms on their desk. The other group of people had peanut M&Ms at their desk, but they had to open up a drawer, reach down and grab the peanut M&Ms. And then the third group of people, there was a bowl of peanut M&Ms for them across the office, but they had to get up, leave their workstation, walk across the office, do the walk of shame because they knew that everybody going over there was going over there for the peanut M&Ms. Just simply putting the M&Ms in the drawer below them, not just being a single like hand reach away, cut consumption by 50%.
That's wild.
And then sticking it across the room actually cut it by like 90%. And because there was a little bit of the social shame and everybody would kind of shit talk around it and stuff like that. But that blew my mind, that just, if it's right there, like literally right there, hand reach away, there's just the speed bump of needing to scoot your chair back, pull the drawer out, scoop your hand in, cut consumption by 50%. And this is some of that stuff where the strategies are critical. I call it the kind of speed bump process, and it works both ways. If you want to make it to the gym and like you've got a super long commute or there are some problems with that, you might be better off parking your car outside and building a home gym, because then you walk out into the garage and you're there. Every little speed bump, impediment from online marketing, when you're trying to sell people stuff, every single time someone needs to click, typically the conversions reduce themselves by 50%. It's like 50%, 50%. And so you can tweak these things both positively and negatively to make some good impact in the direction that you want. And again, to your point, and I really like that heuristic for looking at this stuff. You have like the motivation. I want to be around for my kids to see them graduate and see grandkids. Okay, that's kind of your anchor and your North Star. And then you have that discipline piece. It's like, I will commit to doing this. And now my strategy, so that I don't need to spin out on it every moment of the day, is thinking about like, well, I'm not going to keep peanut M&Ms in the house. If we go out and I want some, then I'll eat some, and whatever's left, I'm pitching it. And that ends up developing this strategy that's really kind of hard to screw up. And one final piece around that also is an absolute poison in this whole story is trying to make perfection the goal. And even the notion of like screwing up. If you eat 3 meals a day, that's 7 days a week, 21 meals. If 19 of those meals are on point and 2 of them aren't, who cares? No big deal. Like if it's the flip, if it's 19 of them are an absolute disaster and 2 are on point, then we've got a problem there. But what people will do is set themselves up for failure so that they can abandon the process, where they're like, oh, I had 5 days of success. I screwed up one day and now I'm done. It's like, no, you didn't screw up. You had a meal off plan. Your next meal will be on plan. Get over it, sack it up, and you're good to go. But those are kind of the strategy on the front end, but then also the greatest psychological hamstringing technique that I see people do, and they'll do it on purpose, where they set it up such that they will guarantee their failure, and they're like, well, I wasn't perfect with it, so I'm just going to abandon. It's like, no, you're not. Like, you don't do anything perfect. Your first shot at archery or your first attempt at an armbar is never perfect. You just keep iterating and doing and working on it.
Yeah, I can see how even I have done that in the past, where we fail to compartmentalize in a way our decisions. So we think, for example, like your scenario, I had 6 good days of the week and I had 1 bad day. Therefore, all the other days didn't count.
Right.
It's like, no. You had 6 good days and 1 bad day. Now let's not compound it, and let's put 6 more days of making the right decisions on the tail end of that.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Totally.
And as you talk about the speed bumps, James Clear actually talks about this. I don't know if you're familiar with James Clear with Atomic Habits. Yeah.
Yep.
He talks about just the process of making things more simple for yourself. Simple in that, hey, this is not a temptation, so I don't have to worry about that. Simple in that your gym scenario, if I want to go to the gym, it's just right outside in the garage. And eliminating those speed bumps, and then putting speed bumps in place where you need to.
At the appropriate spots, yep.
It's just funny as I hear you talk about that with the office scenario of having M&Ms. 2 things came to mind. Number 1, how lazy are we? You know what I mean? Like, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But then the second thing that comes to mind is like, okay, well, we know we're lazy and we have a tendency of not having very good willpower. So let's just acknowledge that and then use that to our advantage.
Yeah, because we either do that or we do what kind of gets into almost the realm of spirituality, mysticism, where it's like, well, we're going to make humanity better, whatever that means, and so we're endeavoring to change who we fundamentally are, which never works. Like it's It's like kind of trying to say, well, we're going to turn a cat into not being a carnivore. No, that's how it's biologically wired. So yeah, we either have an option of acknowledging who we are as human beings and working within those things and figuring out how much latitude that understanding really gives us, or we get stuck in this cul-de-sac of this kind of weird self-improvement thing where, well, my desire for the ice cream is a failure. If I just changed my fundamental being, that I wouldn't want ice cream anymore. It's like, no, that's still a biological imperative. Of course you want a super calorie dense, delicious item. Like that's part of your evolutionary wiring. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. I've actually never heard it painted in that light. It's who you are. And you're not broken, you're not messed up, you aren't a loser. I imagine a lot of people say that, or a piece of shit. You're not those things. You're just a human being who has some evolutionarily hardwired processes and systems, and we need to overcome that. I do have a question about the evolution thing, because this is one argument I've heard a lot, is that with the paleo diet and these types of things, people say, well, we're not evolutionarily hardwired to consume these foods. I get that. I understand that. But then I wonder, okay, so now that we have all these processed foods, is the argument then saying that at some point, whether it's the next 1,000 years or 100,000 years, that human beings will be more able and capable of consuming and processing these processed foods?
Yeah. So I'll try to, it's a really, really good question. This is where the original paleo diet concept didn't provide enough latitude, and it really should have been couched in terms of like ancestral health, like a broader kind of story, because there are some folks that have developed the ability to really do well with dairy, and we've seen that emerge in Northern Europe, in Africa, and in certain places in Asia, Mongolia specifically. And interestingly, the adaptations to do well with dairy is totally different in the 3 different locations. Some of it dealing with the protein, some of it dealing with the lactose. In Mongolia, they largely deal with it by the way that they ferment the dairy. They are actually lactose intolerant, but the way that they ferment the dairy, it removes all the lactose, and so it's not really an issue. But there's some biological changes there that aren't paleo, but this is where I kind of push back, which is that there's a concept called the discordance theory of disease, where at some point our environment changes in such a way that it starts becoming pathological for us, and we are definitely in that spot. Like when we were growing up, there was adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and then there was childhood diabetes, which is type 1, and it's caused by an autoimmune disease. Type 2 diabetes was unheard of, unknown in children. And now I want to say it's like 2/3 or a third of all new type 2 diabetics are below the age of 18.
Wow.
And they've had kids as young as 18 months old with type 2 diabetes from the parents putting Coca-Cola and stuff like that in their bottles.
At 18 months?
18 months is the youngest
Holy
documented
cow.
to my knowledge of type 2 diabetes. And literally 30 years ago, this was unheard of. So this is clearly a situation, like whether we go fully like paleo, caveman reenactment or whatnot, we've reached a point where our food system and our lifestyle is so at odds with the way that our biology is expecting to be born into the world that it's causing some real problems. The interesting thing is that for adaptation to occur so that let's say we could thrive on a processed food diet, you need to have people get so sick that they die before reproductive age, because then there is a selection pressure for the people that do comparatively better. And that's a pretty gnarly scenario. Like,
you wouldn't want that to play out for sure.
You don't want it. And I don't know that even our civilization or society could survive a selection pressure like that. Like it's a really gnarly event.
So basically it kills off, what you're saying is it would kill off anybody who didn't adapt. It's like literally adapt or die.
Yeah. And people may be like, oh, that's bullshit, but there's an interesting example of where this has happened in the past. So the Swidden cultures, which emerged in Central Africa, they developed kind of a slash and burn technology where they would clear an area and then they would plant things like yucca and sweet potatoes, and they lived in pretty close proximity to these areas. But what was interesting is that this slash and burn kind of methodology, it created these open areas where water could be held in kind of standing water, small lakes, small ponds and whatnot. And there had always been mosquitoes and malaria in these areas, but what this technology did is it exploded the populations of mosquitoes that carry malaria. And then these folks started living in these kind of thatched hut scenarios that are a perfect environment for mosquitoes to live in and basically feed on humans. And malaria has a remarkably high fatality rate. It makes people both sick and it kills a good number of people. But a biological adaptation occurred, which is called sickle cell anemia, where if somebody has one copy of the sickle cell genes, their red blood cells, instead of being kind of circular, they're sickled. And what this does is it makes it more difficult for the malaria parasite to live in the person. So it tends to not make them as sick. Somebody with two copies of the sickle cell gene, it causes even more sickling of the cell, but to such a degree that it causes vascular damage, and the person usually dies in childhood. And it's a 1/4 fatality rate. 25% of that population dies from the sickle cell anemia. But that is the selection pressure that makes it possible for that sickle cell anemia to make its way through that population.
Right.
And it's one of the most rapid genetic adaptations that we've ever seen in history. And interestingly, folks that live in the United States that are African American in background, the sickle cell gene is disappearing because there's no longer that selection pressure.
Right.
So this isn't something I'm making up. Like, there's good
Sure.
evolutionary biology that explains this stuff. And it is possible that we could adapt ourselves to living on a more processed food diet. But it really also begs the question, what will we be at the end of that? Because part of clearly what has made humans who we are, the big brains, all the rest of this stuff, was this really nutrient dense diet, of which meat was a primary feature. There's a hypothesis called the expensive tissue hypothesis, that as early hominins started eating meat, mainly from leftover carcasses of other animals' kills, they developed the technology of stone tools and breaking open long bones and getting the bone marrow out, and breaking open the skulls and getting the brains. And that stuff was so nutrient and calorie dense that they didn't need to eat as much vegetable matter. And so the brain was allowed to grow while the gut actually shrank. And when you look at the difference between a human and a chimpanzee or a gorilla, they have quite large brains, but they have much larger guts. And it's exactly the same ratio. Like, the amount of gut we lost is the amount of brain that we gained.
So what I'm understanding you say, and maybe help me round this out, is that if we adapt, either we could potentially run the risk of mass sort of extinction or death, or we would cease to be human at all, is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
We would definitely be a different flavor of human. Like, humanity has evolved over time, and we would definitely be different. And who knows, maybe it could be a good thing. But to get that type of selection pressure, you would have a lot of illness and a lot of death to even facilitate that. And again, the people need to die before reproductive age, so they need to die at like 12 or 13 or something for there to be a sufficient signal in the kind of biological systems for it to be like, well, okay, we need to get really good at dealing with Little Debbie snack cakes as our main source of nutrition. Yeah.
So, I mean, basically the answer, just to sum this up, and from my perspective, is, we probably ought to wait for evolution to take care of itself. We probably ought to adapt ourselves and deliberately and build up our mindset, our fortitude, and our systems to ensure that we can handle the changing landscape with society, culture, and food.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yes, absolutely. And I guess in some ways that kind of circles back around a little bit to the Sacred Cow book, which tackles the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. And the first place that we jump in there is actually the health story, because when you look at folks that tend to not eat a meat-inclusive diet, they tend to not fare as well. And you really see this at the two ends of the life cycle extremes. Infants and children, breastfeeding moms, and then also older people. And the nutrient deficiencies, lack of protein, failure to thrive are endemic in these populations. And it's kind of this middle of the life cycle, like 20s through 40s, 20s through 50s, that people to varying degrees can do okay on a more vegan-centric, vegetarian-type diet. But it's because they don't have those real growth demands of childhood, nor the near end of life demands where we need to improve our nutrient intake, improve our protein intake. Like one of the biggest factors of whether or not we remain independent is our maintenance of muscle mass and bone mineral density. And one of the two primary drivers with that, inactivity and a lack of protein intake. But people are terrified of protein. They think it's going to give them cancer and, all kinds of different things like that. So it's interesting. And this is where this puzzle gets fascinating to me when we start talking about the regenerative agriculture story, like small decentralized farms all over the place. It's really good for the environment. It's fantastic for economies and local infrastructure. Like instead of all the middle of America, and honestly, this is all over the world, but the United States in particular, the small time farm used to be the economic engine of the United States. Right. We're in this interesting scenario where, say, artificial intelligence is being predicted to displace all of these different work roles for human beings. And ironically, some of the first things that are going to go is going to be doctoring and lawyering, because this stuff is so algorithmically driven that as it is right now, there are computer programs that do a better job of diagnosing disease than doctors do for the most part.
Without the baggage, we'll call it baggage.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right term. The baggage of human emotion and experience and biases and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. And what's interesting is anybody in this artificial intelligence scene that talks about this topic of, AI displacing human work, they concede that the last place that this will be a factor is in creative endeavors, things where human creativity is an important factor. Sure. And a lot of people suggest that we'll never see AI that really encompasses the creativity that the human mind can bring to bear on problems. And people have painted ranchers and farmers as these kind of dumb lug nuts, and they're not really that sophisticated. But all that ranchers and farmers do, particularly in that regenerative ag scene where they're not relying on the industrial row crop system to make this whole thing go, all they do is problem solve, like morning, noon, and night. When do you move the electric fences? How do you birth a cow? There's all this stuff. And it's fairly labor intensive, but folks can make a good living doing this stuff, and it's very rewarding. You're feeding yourself and you're feeding your community. Like it's kind of hard to think of something that's not more meaningful in that regard. And so this is a lot of the stuff that we try to unpack in the book. Health is important, the environment's important, but then there's this whole economic piece and just finding and embracing meaningful work that has really been kind of destroyed with the industrialization of our food system.
I really love that you're talking about this, because I've got some own personal experiences in my life. And we were talking before we hit record on this podcast, but how I moved up here to Maine. Well, we've got 50 acres here. And I would say, I don't know exactly, but I would say roughly 35 to 40 acres of it is field. We've got a neighbor across the field who comes and hays the field. And then he takes that hay and he feeds his cow, and he pays us, he compensates us in beef. That's right. Our arrangement. Right. And then a couple of weeks ago, he came by and he's like, "Hey, Ryan, I really want to make sure the hay is sustainable and make sure this is working correctly. And so I'm going to bring a big load of chicken crap over here, and we're going to spread it all over your entire field. It's going to stink for 3 or 4 days, but it's going to be better for both of us."
Yeah.
And we're neighborly. We're cooperating. We get to know each other better. I have food for my family. He gets the hay that he needs. My field is hayed and has a beautiful view. I've got another neighbor. In fact, he's downstairs right now. He's building out some bathrooms in the barn that we have. He's got 15 to 20 head of cattle, And my son goes over every couple of weeks and butchers the chickens and goes through that process. And he's got the cattle that he cycles through, and he lives a really good life with his family, and he's teaching his daughters and his sons how to farm. And anecdotally, I see the evidence, and I love the lifestyle. I love the way of life, and I love all of the things that it brings in as far as bringing together a community, having clean, locally sourced meat and provisions for yourself, learning the skill of harvesting animals, which is something that I think is important. There's just so much beyond the nutritional benefits of this for me and my family.
Yeah, and that's kind of the cool thing. It's kind of I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but good diet, good lifestyle is good for all of these multiplicative reasons. You have more bone mineral density, you have greater muscle mass, you feel better, you're more motivated. So there's all, it's like benefit, 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 benefit. Whereas these extractive processes of like industrializing the food system, it's like, well, it damages the soil and it kills all the native flora and fauna, and holy smokes, like the insect population has plummeted. And so there's all that, like, okay, we get an assumed benefit that we're getting some food out of this system, which is usually kind of low nutrient quality food. But then we have all these other factors, like jobs have been destroyed, waterways are damaged or destroyed. The very soil that we grow the food out of is washing away or blowing away. And so it's like negative, 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 kind of sort of one positive, and so these regenerative systems, what they call holistic management, it's not holistic in like kind of a hippie chakra balancing thing. It's, I need to look at the whole system.
Right.
Like, we need to really look at what are all the inputs, what are all the outputs, and really assess that in a critical way, and then stack the deck so that we get as much benefit out of this as we can. You're an investment guy, so like you would.
Well, I was going to say, it seems like to me that, and I'm just speaking generally, that society has put the villain pin on the wrong culprit, right? They've put it on meat, for example, when I don't know that it should have been placed on meat, because the first thing you talk about in the book is the scapegoat of meat, right? Cancer and the economy and global warming and everything else that goes with it. So we placed that villain pin on the meat. It's not the meat. It was the process. It was the system that the villain pin should have been pinned on, if that makes sense how I'm saying that.
Yeah. And it's a really compelling story. It, on a kind of intuitive level, it kind of makes sense. Like I grew up in Northern California, and you go up and down Interstate 5, and there are these huge, feedlots, and like there's a good 20-minute period where you like roll up the windows and close.
Definitely,
close
I've been on that road.
It smells horrible.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
And that is not a good scene. It's not good for the animals. It's not good for the local environment. And all of that is a consequence of a system that has gotten more and more consolidated, more and more monopolized. And it's not good for anybody. It doesn't produce good food. It doesn't produce the same number of jobs or the infrastructure that we would have. This kind of globalization of our food system is really a bad thing. But yet we don't look at the row crops that are a part of that system and vilify them to the degree that they need to be vilified. It's almost exclusively, all of the problems are laid ironically at beef. And, the chicken and pork production thing is actually to the degree that there's some merit about like the kind of unsustainability of meat production. Chicken and pork, you could make some cases around that. Like pre-1940s, chicken and pork were a very secondary food source. Like chicken was something that you had on like family gatherings. It was a rare thing, and what people ate day to day was beef and lamb for the most part. These large grazing animals were the cornerstone of the protein that we ate, and these other items like
much more efficient. Is that why?
Much more efficient, because they're just eating grass. We can't eat grass, as humans.
Right. They turn vegetables into meat, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Whereas there is a case to be made, chicken and pork grow almost exclusively off of corn and soybean,
right?
Which you could argue could be fed to humans. I would argue that I would rather just grow much more pastured meat and feed that to humans. But there is a a poor resource allocation there. Like there's a lot of energy that goes into creating grains and soybeans and turning that into feed and then feeding that to animals. So
that's a good point, because I think about our scenario. I believe we've got roughly 20 chickens or so. And yeah, we buy feed for them. Mm-hmm. But the cattle that my neighbors have, we don't have cattle ourselves. They don't buy feed except for in the winter, maybe, or they bale their hay and then that uses for the winter. But yeah, it's much more sustainable. That makes sense.
And generally what folks like that will do is they'll move the cattle through an area, and then after the cattle get moved to a new paddock, then the chickens are brought in. Usually they have like a mobile chicken tractor, and then the chickens eat the bugs and the worms, and they pick through the poo, and they poo themselves.
Right.
And and the bulk of their food comes from that. And you can supplement them in the winter and whatnot. But when you look at like a nature program talking about the Serengeti, and if they do like a full deal on it, they'll talk about like all the wildebeest and water buffalo that go through and they poop everywhere. And then there are like dung beetles that pop up, and then there are birds that go through and, play their role in that whole system. So birds really should be kind of a secondary, tertiary feature of a legit sustainable food system. Whereas over the course of time, like Americans eat about 30% less beef than what they did 30 years ago, but they eat proportionally more chicken than what they used to. And chicken is kind of portrayed as more of a sustainable, more like kind of feminine food or what.
Yeah, healthier. Sure.
But it's really not.
What's funny is, so I wanted to ask you, because I knew we were having this conversation, and I wanted to ask you something maybe somewhat political. It seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, because you have more evidence on this than I do, but it seems like meat eaters tend to be more conservative in nature, and your vegans and vegetarians tend to be more liberal in nature. Is that, do you believe, is that kind of in line with what you've seen, and why is that?
I'm not entirely sure why, but I've seen that for a long time. And this sounds like kind of a prick thing to say, but I've said that veganism is the state religion of progressivism, like the state religious diet of progressivism.
Agreed, for sure.
And it's not 100%. Like there are some folks out there that I will get pushback on it. They're like, "Hey, I'm super liberal, but I eat meat," but it's
It just seems like generally these are the camps we fall into.
It's a damn good trend. And, one of the things, I've been just poking the bear on like cancel culture. I'm like, come on, just bring it. Just cancel me.
Yeah.
Like I'm ready to go open my farm and just be like done,
For sure.
And one of the things, just in this whole COVID thing, like there's this thing of, well, let's take care of the people that are really at risk. We know crystal clear who those people are. Mm-hmm. And then for the rest of us, if you like, if I feel like, oh, wow, I'm really scared of it, then I'll wear a mask and I'll do my social distancing. Mm-hmm. And then for other people, you do whatever the hell you want to do. And again, there seems to be kind of a political divide on that, whereas there are other people that are of the mind, it's like, we must do everything possible to save every life we can. It's like, okay, that's a noble
I can appreciate
notion.
That. Sure.
Yeah, I can appreciate that until, again, we look at externalities, knock-on consequences. We left Reno a little over a year ago, but every single restaurant we used to go to is closed. Like they're all gone. And we're friends with some of the people that had them, and they're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like one guy, his wife intervened in a suicide. Like he was literally in the process of killing himself after this. So where does saving that life factor into this story? Mm-hmm. Where are we going to be a year or 2 years from now when like every small, this is kind of an interesting thing. Did Walmart get closed? Did Target get closed? No, but all these small businesses got closed. Mm-hmm. So and what's ironic is the more left-leaning people will rail against like capitalism and globalization and all this type of stuff. We destroyed and are destroying our internal base of small businesses. The only thing we're going to have left are like big box options at the end of this thing. And this is just this real interesting disconnect. And it's something that Diana and I talk about in the book, is that we feel like there's a massive disconnect between the realities of life and death. And people in this kind of more left-leaning arena, I think that they're very empathetic in many ways. Like they just feel strong emotions and
yeah,
whatnot.
I agree with that.
And there's a desire to mitigate suffering, which again, I think is a noble goal.
Is noble, sure.
But the irony is the path to hell is paved on good intentions. And our world is so complex that here's a possibly decent example. In India, as it was growing, this was about 20 years ago, even though it's industrializing and growing rapidly, it still is this kind of wild place. Like there's tigers that will make their way into like urban centers and stuff like that. Wow. And one of the problems that they had is that there are cobras everywhere, and these things can clearly kill you. Sure. So the government enacted a program where they would pay people, I think either for like the skin of the cobra or the head of the cobra or something like that. And so it was kind of this bounty system.
Sure.
Yeah. And people realized, man, cobras breed like crazy. So I'll raise cobras, turn them in for the bounty, which is a great idea. People respond to incentives. But once the government got wind that people were raising cobras for the bounty, then they canceled the program. Then people dumped these cobras out into the streets, and the problem was literally like 10 times worse than what it was before.
Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, yeah. And I think that our world is fraught with those. And when people don't recognize that we are part of this biological system, that we will live and we will die, and that everything will live and die, then we have a tendency to make decisions as if we could intervene in that process in a way that will either halt death, or that we can just like kick the can on it indefinitely. And I think that that's a really big part of this. And a lot of folks that have been vegan, if they go and they do some work on, say, like a regenerative farm, and they see the way that these systems work together, they're like, oh, I have to have animals on the land. And like what your neighbor is doing is like, hey, I've got a load of chicken shit coming over because otherwise we're gonna strip mine all the nutrients out of your soil, and I won't have hay anymore for my animals. Right. So like there has to be this cyclical process. And when people understand that we're part of a system, part of a cycle, it doesn't mean that we treat each other or the other organisms on this planet horribly. Like we can always have goals of treating people and animals better, but it also doesn't mean that the only route to like a moral way of producing food is a vegan diet. In fact, when you look at the knock-on effects of like the industrial row crop food system, it kills an enormous amount of life, from small animals to the invertebrates in the soil to birds, insects.
Yeah, but I don't think people care as much. Those individuals who are concerned about that, from my perspective, it doesn't seem like they care as much about insects as they do about furry things.
It's true. And this is where we start getting into some apples to apples comparisons. So a mouse is a mammal and a cow is a mammal. And they're actually pretty similar in intelligence, even though their size is dramatically different. And when you look at the number of mice and birds and reptiles that are killed in the process of the industrial row crop food system, it's enormous. And a guy out of Oregon State, he did a paper looking at the least harm principle, which is this idea of, okay, an ethical food system would cause the least amount of death and suffering.
Right.
And in his analysis, what that looks like is lots of grazing animals on lots of grass, and then fruits, nuts and seeds, and some root crops like potatoes and beets and stuff like that. And that's actually where you produce the most food and cause the least death and the least harm. And one of the fascinating places that we've seen some embracing of this regenerative system is the Audubon Society. Historically, these folks have been really antagonistic towards ranching. And ranching can be done poorly, and it can damage the environment. And then if you pull grazing animals off of grasslands entirely, those grasslands will also perform poorly. They will die.
Sure. Right.
But there's this kind of middle ground in there. But what's been happening in these holistically managed grasslands is that the bird populations have rebounded. Like these endangered species and these at-risk species have been exploding in these holistically managed environments because these grasslands co-evolved with all of these birds, all of these insects, all of these animals. And so if you do something that improves the ability for these birds to be there, that it improves the ability for you to raise cattle or goats or sheep on these grasslands. So
Right.
this regenerative process actually improves the ability to have more life exist in these scenarios versus the industrial row crop food system. Like it's monoculture. You kill everything except the soybeans you're growing or the corn you're growing.
When I hear this, I think of the level of arrogance that we as a species have to believe that we can just isolate ourselves above what we see in the environment. And I think the conclusion I've drawn over the past several years as I've got into hunting and now I see my neighbors ranching and things like that is that it's not that we humans are above and that we can dictate almost as gods how the world will work, but that we just assume our position in the environment, right? And we do it with a level of stewardship, with long-term thinking. That's what I think about my neighbor when he comes and drops the manure off. I think, okay, obviously it's in his best interest to continue the crop, obviously, right? And it actually helps everything else. It's a win-win situation. But we need to pull ourselves off the pedestal of thinking that we can solve every little problem and we can do away with harm and we can do away with death and just assume with a level of maturity and stewardship our place in the environment and in the world.
I completely agree. And again, I don't know if this is a great analogy, but the current food system to me is like someone who thinks that they can live indefinitely on a credit card.
Yes.
It just won't work. Like you can live kind of large, but there's going to be a day of reckoning with that. And this is what I'm a big fan of economics, particularly the kind of Austrian economic stuff. And this is kind of a failure of a lot of modern economists when they look at our food system. They're like, oh, it's incredibly efficient and all this stuff. It looks efficient so long as you ignore all the other externalities, all the damage to the environment, the loss of work, the loss of just kind of traditional food systems and stuff like that, like has occurred in developing countries. It literally is living on borrowed time. Whereas, if we live within our means and reinvest in ourselves and in the communities and the environment around us, then things can perform a stepwise improvement over time. But if we're just continually trying to live off of credit, which again is, from my perspective, the way that the modern food system is designed, there will be a failure point at some time in the future. I don't know if it's 5 years or 50 years, but it will happen, and it can be catastrophic if we haven't made allowances for diversifying the way that we do things.
What does that failure look like? Like, how would that actually play out?
Jared Diamond has a book called Collapse, and it looks at different societies that have become remarkably civilized, like fairly sophisticated civilizations, and then these civilizations have disappeared. And virtually all of them ended up running into problems at the food production side. They became too extractive. And it's it varies.
When you say
from
extractive, would another word for that be consumptive? Is that what you're saying?
By extractive, you're not putting anything back.
Got
so
it. It's not that regenerative process.
It's not that regenerative closed loop cycle kind of deal.
Got it.
Yeah. And he also has examples of cultures that almost got to the brink, and they managed to tweak some things and kind of pull it back. The examples of success are far fewer than the examples of failure. But this is one spot where I do think that human ingenuity is incredible. And we could do some really good things by kind of pulling ourselves back from the brink. But the interesting thing, going back to this kind of socio-political story, is that folks are so wed to some ideas around like climate change and the negative impacts that they assume that animals have on the environment, that actually this tool of regenerative agriculture, we pull more carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it underground in the production of grass-fed meat than what is produced. And we're talking about methane and carbon equivalents and all the rest of this stuff. There was a great...
Because I thought cow farts were the problem.
One would think so. And then, during COVID, the cows kept farting, but the transportation industry it cratered. and all of our greenhouse gas emissions plummeted during
Isn't that amazing?
time. Yeah, yeah. So again, we have a very empirical, real world example. Like if there was one good thing that came out of COVID, there's a few silver linings. That was one of the silver linings, where it's like the cow population actually increased during that time, but greenhouse gas emissions just fell off a cliff.
I mean, I'm looking at this and I hope people wake up and realize, maybe we don't need to commute as much as we did. Maybe we don't need to live in these big centralized locations of concrete jungles, and realize that we can spread out a little bit. We don't need to commute as much as we once thought. We can get to know our neighbors, and yet we can still conduct business in a very efficient manner.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a cool thing. Like if a COVID type situation had happened in the 1980s, we might not have seen that shift. But there is a really fascinating opportunity. Like people are fleeing the big cities in droves,
yes,
and they're going to what they call these second and third tier cities, and like the food is going there, the culture is going there. So it could be a real fascinating renaissance. And it's interesting, again, within this kind of more kind of vegan centric model of the world, there's this notion that we should live all of humanity in a few mega cities, and then the rest of the world should just be, left to go back to being wild. And there's a counterpoint to that, which is this notion that people should actually live in a much more distributed, decentralized kind of scenario. And again, under this pandemic, what areas fared the worst were the mega cities, and we saw that these second and third tier size cities fared quite well, by comparison, both in like transmission and death rates and whatnot, but also quality of life. But there's some real cases to be made around the quality of life, the economic kind of diversification that can occur under those scenarios. We saw a big scare with the hiccups in our food system. Like there were meat shortages and whatnot that were wholly, due to the centralized processing that occurs. Like there is effectively a monopoly on the processing of meat in the United States. There's 4 companies that own virtually all of the processing capacity.
And it's funny because, I take our scenario again. I'm just coming back to my own personal stories, and it's like, people were worried about meat shortages, and I'm like, we're probably pretty good for this year because we've got elk, bear, moose, deer, and beef in the freezer.
Right.
And I shot some of it. Some of my neighbors shot some of it. Others of my neighbors butchered it, and we just bought 20 chickens from our neighbors across the road. Like, we're pretty good. This goes back to your decentralized notion of let's decentralize this and let these people, take care of themselves and their community members.
Yeah, yeah. And Senator Thomas Massie, I think he's in Kentucky. He has a bill called the Prime Act, which is really moving to allow more local meat processing to occur. And I don't know if people realize this, but right now, if you have a locally owned butcher shop or like a higher end restaurant that can receive a whole cow and then part it out and process it, they are allowed to do that, and they're monitored under the local health department, agencies. So it's not like they just do this with no oversight, but they have much more latitude than the main meat processing facilities, which must be USDA certified. And there's all these kind of crazy standards that occur there. Prior to World War II, there were like 200,000 meat processing facilities in the United States. Like there was literally one.
Instead of 4, you said?
Yeah. Well, there's about 150 facilities, but they're owned by 4 companies.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
2 of those companies are foreign owned, one by China and one by Brazil. And the Brazilian company, JBL, it just shut down its processing of lamb at the facilities that it owns, basically creating a monopoly for itself to export lamb from Brazil into the United States, which I think is absolute insanity.
So that's where we're getting our lamb. That interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
And this is where, I feel like conservatives and progressives should have a meeting of the minds. If you're conservative, does it raise your hackles from a national security perspective that China owns a quarter of our food production?
Definitely. Just like with the pharmaceutical production and access to medication, we run into the same scenario.
Yeah. And if you're more on the progressive side of the fence, are you comfortable with the human rights considerations of some of these companies and the globalization and whatnot?
Point.
So this is a thing where, do you want more access and more scrutiny? That would happen if our food systems occur at a local level, if our food processing occurs at a local level. You have thousands of more eyes on it. And when you even get into the whole notion of, say, like greed and graft and mismanagement, how many more people do you need to buy off if there's 200,000 locally owned facilities for you to get a wink, wink, nod, nod in the way that you're doing things, versus if it's owned by 4 companies and they have a monopoly on this stuff? Like, you have fewer doors to knock on, fewer people to buy off to get, a dodgy food practices through. So I just can't think of why this decentralization wouldn't resonate with anybody in the social political spectrum, so long as they really understand the full picture.
And that's the point. You just made the point, because I think everybody can get behind what we're talking about. The problem is our information is filtered through those who want to consolidate power.
Yeah.
Right. So a different narrative is communicated, and then that's what we hear, and then we choose to adopt that narrative based on our own experiences and perceptions and viewpoints. And so I think in a lot of ways, the powers that would be filter the information we receive, paint it in the way they want to paint it, so they can continue to consolidate power. I'll give you an example. Years ago, when we were living in southern Utah, you and I talked about this. My wife had 20 goats at one point. And there was a couple families in the community who they had children who could not consume cow milk for whatever reason. Their systems wouldn't allow them to. I don't know the specifics. You would know more than I did. So they would come to us and they would buy goat milk. Well, we ended up getting, I can't remember if we got a letter or there was something, and it was either the city or the county or the state that said that we cannot sell that or even give that goat milk to these families because it wasn't pasteurized and there was some other processes that they wanted in place. And I just thought, what a shame. Here's a family that's a neighbor. We're trying to do a good thing for them. They come and they pick up a couple of gallons of goat milk. It serves their kids. It serves them. They save some money. And it's just so frustrating that we have all this red tape and these things in place that keep us from doing the types of things you're talking about.
Yeah, the raw milk access, that's a good barometer for how totalitarian a given state is.
Yes.
Is just that raw milk access. And, this stuff always happens for your safety. Like, there was one foodborne illness outbreak and we need to lock all this stuff down. And instead of figuring out ways where people can still conduct business person to person, and maybe we have some degree of oversight or some type of process in there so that we have some controls. And also, at the end of the day, if those people know you guys and they get sick from your milk or your cheese, they know exactly who to go to and who to complain
where it came
to.
from.
Actually
exactly.
you're gonna be like, oh my God, well let's figure out how we can fix this and make it right. Yeah, like there is no reason, the incentives don't align for you to like hide it and stifle it. It's like you gotta tackle that stuff head on, and it's it is crazy the wars that have been fought over the raw milk gig. Like there have been instances of these Amish farmers where like the DEA arrives, body armor, armored personnel carriers
for farmers,
for the
and
unarmed
ranchers.
Farmers, pacifists, like and like if there's work that needs to be done, that's probably not the work that needs to be done. But it's interesting. There are these kind of keystone topics, and like food access and freedom to food is one of these like linchpin things that from local on up to federal levels, they really want control over that. Because if we start controlling our own food system, we can opt out in a variety of ways. We're not dependent on the largesse of the government and you know, that whole thing. And that starts sounding a little bit InfoWar, type stuff.
I don't think so, but maybe I lean that way anyways.
It's really true. And again, this again goes, and also, why can't you have, if you want to buy something from a USDA inspected facility because that's what you feel comfortable with, great.
Then do that.
I don't want to. So let me do that. Mm-hmm. And then you do you and I'll do me. And this is a really interesting delta or difference in these two ideologies. Joel Salatin, good friend of mine and a pretty famous regenerative farmer, he was giving a public talk on this stuff, and there was a family there that was either vegan or vegetarian. I forget which, but they said, well, you know, you raise a lot of meat. Like, what am I going to do in this story? And Joel said, if you let me feed my family the way I want to feed them, I promise you I will make enough food for you to feed your family the way you want to feed them. But just let me do that. And there were, you know, but that doesn't reciprocate both ways. Like, this more progressive kind of left-leaning sentiment is like, I am going to dictate to you whether or not you can graze animals on your land.
Definitely.
I'm going to create meat taxes, so it's harder for you to sell your meat because I have this ideological bent that, you know, it's unethical to eat animals, it's unhealthy, and it's bad for the environment.
Like, I never met somebody who consumes meat who has actively gone out of their way to make it more difficult for a vegetarian or a vegan to consume what they want to consume. Never.
Right.
Now, that individual might tease them, might mock them, might make fun of them, poke at them a little bit. I've certainly done that.
Right.
But I've never gone out of my way to make it harder for them to live their lifestyle. But if you flip that around, you have the opposite, it seems to me.
You don't have that reciprocity on the other side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, that's just it. Maybe it's broad brushstrokes, but I've been in this game for like 22 years, and this is definitely the trend that I see. And I think that you could very easily get into an online discussion with somebody, and you would see this play out where it's like, hey man, I'm going to shut you down. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you can't buy meat, grow meat, sell meat. You know, and there are people that are definitely of that opinion. And when we look at where this has gone at like the global level, the CDC, the World Health Organization, they're on a campaign to try to limit meat access. And they're wrapping the whole thing into climate change. And ironically, the places that are pushing back are developing countries, because these developing countries still have intact traditional food systems that have done a fairly good job of feeding the folks that they serve. And they're not completely beholden to the outputs of the industrial row crop food system that basically comes out of the United States and Europe. So ironically, some of the biggest pushback that has occurred on this idea that you should abandon all animal husbandry has been coming from the developing world. There are people that are just like, we're not going to do this. We're not going to become completely dependent on the grain exports of the United States. And I think that that's a really smart thing to do. If they want to do some collaborative trade, great. Become completely dependent upon us, that's a terrible idea.
Definitely. So, you know, as we kind of wrap this up, I want to be respectful of your time, and I could go on more and more about this, but what does the average man do? Does he vote with his dollars? Does he buy a ranch somewhere? Like, what does the average person who's listening to this podcast do? They're hearing this, they're like, yeah, this all makes sense to me. I want to contribute and play my part in this. What does that guy do?
Well, first, nobody is average. Everybody's above average. But
sure, you know what I'm saying.
No, I get
it. The person who's listening, right?
You know, so you've shared some great personal anecdotes, so I'll share some of mine. We're really thinking that our next step in this evolution will be to, I will probably always have some degree of an online presence, but the next iteration will be dramatically curtailed online presence and mainly focusing on regenerative food production, like really investing in that.
For your family, for your community? Do you see it broadening out from yourself?
Like it would be an economic enterprise. That would be kind of the
Gotcha.
primary, or at least one of the main things that we do. As it is, like when we lived in Reno, we had 2 acres, we had sheep and goats, and like we really dramatically improved the quality of the land there, and I learned a lot.
When you say improve the quality of the land, Rob, can you, like, what specifically, how did it improve?
Yeah. It was massively overgrazed. So like there were erosion channels all over this property where like when it would rain, you would just have topsoil like bleeding.
And it was so dry
off of
anyways, I'm sure, and everything, right? Yeah.
Reno's quite dry, but what we did is we bought some portable electric fencing, and we just started moving these animals around. And so they would
them through.
appropriately graze in this area. And 3 years later, we had chest-high perennial grasses there. And we had one of the biologists from UNR come out and look, and they're like, I didn't even know these grasses grew here. Like this was stuff that they thought was gone. Some of these grass seeds can exist in the soil for like 100 years. It's crazy, you know. And and the way that the erosion had occurred, I didn't even know that it had all been washed away. But that's a good example in what that grass there did, what that land is now doing. It's sequestering carbon, so it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it underground as it feeds the root system and actually grows more topsoil.
So the plants are pulling that carbon out of the environment, using it, consuming it, right, and doing what they do. Sure, okay, got it.
Some of that carbon goes into the grass growing up, and a lot of it goes into growing the root systems below ground, and that actually feeds into the production of new topsoil. Yeah.
Which I think would help even, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we see some of these like landslides, for example, and all of that stuff has just been burned away and rotted away and grazed away and everything else.
Yeah, yeah. So that's another thing, is it really enhances the water retention capacity of the soil.
Right.
So there have been some kind of pithy remarks that it's not how much rain you get, it's how much rain you keep. And you know, a poorly managed area, most of the water just kind of runs off. It's hard pan, you don't retain it. But in these really spongy grasslands, like I forget the exact number, but it improves the water retention capacity of the ground by like 100-fold. Like a cubic meter of soil ends up holding like tons of, literally metric tons of water in that cubic meter. So if you think about this, expanded over millions and millions of acres around the world, like there's a huge potential benefit there. But if you feel like, you know, doing that, but that's a big change. Like, you know,
a big change.
It's a big change. But for the people who do that, certainly supporting locally raised food and building those relationships, I think that that's great. The flip side of this is that people, again, can get into making perfection the antithesis of good enough. And so, like, if you are a young guy and you know, a father and you've got kids and you're working your way up in the world and your budget is tight, feed the most nutrient dense food you can to your family, and go to Costco and go to Walmart and do the best job you can. Like, eating conventionally raised meat, conventionally raised fruits and vegetables is way better than feeding your family bagels and Twinkies. Like, it's just no doubt about it. And then folks with a little more resources, then support the local grass-fed producers and whatnot. And there is a reality anywhere else in the world. Grain-finished meat costs more than grass-finished meat because it has more inputs. The only reason why that happens in the United States is because of our farm subsidies. If you go to Australia, they will highlight it's like grain-finished meat, and you'll pay 30 or 40% more for a given cut because it's much more energy intensive to raise that stuff.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And
so we've subsidized it. The government has subsidized it to the point where we have it backwards.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which isn't super surprising when and this is the danger of getting in and fiddling with these things, you know? So for the person with a little more means, if you want to get in and help in these endeavors, there are also some really interesting companies coming online, some investment opportunities. And I can ping this to you because I know you share a lot of this stuff with your folks, where people can invest in groups that that provide financing for people entering or expanding their regenerative practices. This is not going to be a unicorn. You're not going to get a 50x return on this stuff,
right.
But it's something that will do good in the world, and it should remain inflation and recession resistant, because people are always going to produce food, and
and they always have to consume it as well. Sure,
they always have to consume it.
Yeah.
And then again, for the person who a young guy just getting going in the world, feed yourself and feed your family the best you can within your budget, and don't let these high-minded ideals. You got to triage things, and if you are still in that precarious position where you haven't gotten yourself financially and kind of economically buttoned up so that you're pretty solid, that is concern number one. Take care of your own self first. Then you start getting some resources, you get some better connections. Then you can start thinking about paying it back and weaving some of your success back into your local environment. But that's another thing that I see folks do, where they'll feel guilty that they can't eat every meal from pastured meat and whatnot because they're a college student or whatever. And that's just incredibly misplaced in that regard. Do good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect right out of the gate, but it's far better, again, to focus on a nutrient dense protein, animal protein centric diet for both you and your family. Everybody's going to be healthier. Everybody's going to do better. And it's going to facilitate you getting to a degree of success in your life that you can then weave it back into this other stuff.
Yeah. You're reminding me of, I believe it's a Theodore Roosevelt quote. He says, start with what you have, do what you can with where you are, or so, I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. Just do something, and then next year when you're in a better spot, you do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And that's very similar to what we've been able to do. I remember times where literally pacing around my backyard, which was, quarter of an acre lot, wondering how I was going to make the mortgage payment. Fortunately, we've gone past that particular problem, and things change, and now we're in a different situation. But it started somewhere, right? It started somewhere, and then you just build it from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Robb, I appreciate you. I said I wanted to be respectful of your time. We went a little longer than I thought we would, but that's okay. Hopefully it was okay for you.
I'm long-winded.
But all of this information was, I knew this was going to be a great conversation. My head's like, the wheels are turning, like even more so, because it was better than I thought it would be. And I think the guys are going to get a lot of value from it. Go pick up a copy of the book, guys, Sacred Cow, and also Wired to Eat, because you're going to learn about this stuff obviously more in depth, and what you can do about it and how you can participate in all this stuff. So, Robb,
just really quickly, in October, we have a film coming out, Sacred Cow, which expands on the material in the book. And so if somebody doesn't want to read a book, or someone knows someone that doesn't want to read a book, the film is pretty awesome. Yeah.
That's great. I know most of the guys listening are readers, so they will read the book.
Cool.
But when that comes available, let me know, because I want to share it on my end so that people can get access to this, because I think this stuff is important. And as I begin to, I wouldn't say immerse, but take a few steps in the door of this world, I can see how valuable it actually is. So really appreciate your dedication to the research, the amount of time that you've just put into pouring over this information, and obviously you're well versed and well researched in this, and I really, really appreciate that from you.
Thank you. Huge honor, man. Thank you.
Thanks, Robb. Appreciate it.
Bye.